Let's go to Jerusalem now, where we can speak to Jeff Halper, long-time Israeli peace activist, author and the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Thank you so much, Jeff, for your time. From your perspective, watching what is playing out physically on the ground and then what's happening internationally in terms of almost this sort of propaganda war of people making statements, how are you feeling that the international committee is handling, the international community, sorry, is handling what is happening on the ground?
Well, there's a very interesting disconnect, and that is that Israel clearly has the support of the world's governments, especially the G7 that run the world, but certainly the governments of the world, most of them. Macron was here yesterday. Biden has been here. I mean, it's almost, unmitigated support for Israel's right of self-defense, which is assuming that they're being attacked from a foreign territory, which is not the case. It's occupied territory. On the other hand, there's been a huge outpouring of support for Palestinians. In London, you've had huge demonstrations all over the world. And I think the peoples of the world, and certainly there's been a shift in public opinion, including in the United States and including among Jews in the United States, that actually what Guterres said, this isn't happening in a vacuum, that you can't ignore the political context, that there is an occupation, and that this didn't begin on October 7th. So I think what Israel's narrative is trying to say is that this is an attack in a vacuum. It happened, and we're simply responding. Whereas I think the peoples of the world realize that this is really an ongoing, not a conflict really, an ongoing colonization and oppression of the Palestinian people. And so the question is going to be who, in the end, is going to call the shots. Is it going to be governments that control our foreign policies, but will not do the right thing, because they're very transactional, and Israel has much more to offer them in terms of military support and being a surrogate to the Middle East than the Palestinians do? Or will somehow justice and human rights and international law and values begin to play a role? And I think that's what the peoples of the world are trying to push.
Yeah, which of those forces do you think is going to end up holding the power?
Well, the power is held by the governments, unfortunately. They have the power, they have the right to have armies, they supposedly have the right to wage war. Even in our language, we talk about terrorism. But terrorism is only applied to non-state actors. It's never applied to states. I mean, if you compare, the damage and the death and the destruction that Israel is causing in Gaza at this moment, the thousands of people that you mentioned, about 6,500 people have died, most of them innocent civilians, half of them children, versus the terrible and horrible things that happened inside Israel, which by itself has to be condemned. I'm not making any comparisons. But if you're simply talking about military actions or violence or whatever, state terrorism is something we never talk about. Israel has been engaged in state terrorism against the Palestinians for the last 75 years, from 1948, when they drove 750 Palestinians out of the country and took their lands, to the occupation in 1967, to house demolitions. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Israel's demolished, only since 1967, about 60,000 Palestinian homes and mosques and schools and businesses. All that is state terrorism. But we don't use that terminology because governments and the media actually control the language that we use. And that's why it's easy for us to condemn groups like Hamas that sometimes do terrorist acts, but at the same time, we don't condemn, when Israel it does terrorist acts, it's defended by governments because it's one of their club. And they have the right to self-defense. They have a legitimate right to use armed force. And again, the political context and the asymmetry is missing. And I think that's what the peoples of the world see that governments don't.
Language has been really important over the last couple of weeks. The real challenge now, and you sort of stressed it there, you know, the international community is saying to Israel, you've got the right to defend yourself, but you must minimise civilian casualties. That is proving to be extremely difficult to put into practice. And we're hearing now that Israel have said, under pressure from the US, from the White House, that they will delay this. What we keep hearing is an imminent ground invasion, which they've said they'll hold off for now. How do you see, Jeff, in your analysis of what actually happens in the next week, in the next month or so?
You know, it's very hard to know. I think Yotam gave a very good analysis, the person before me. You know, this isn't happening in a vacuum also in terms of the regional politics and what's happening here. I think the Israeli military is very keen on invading. I mean, their contention is that you cannot wipe out Hamas, militarily speaking, not politically speaking, without a ground invasion. And they're very keen to do that. But on the other hand, of course, there is a wider context. If Hezbollah is a much more powerful military force in the north, in Lebanon and in Syria, you know, they have something like 150,000 but major missiles, not kind of homemade missiles like Hamas has. So if they open that front, that really even calls Israel's existence into account, and that might have to prompt an American response. Well, if there's an American response, they have their fleets off Lebanon. That's going to provoke an Iranian response. In other words, this whole thing could
escalate hugely, yeah.
Control.
And clearly, lots of parties
that's the thoughts behind maybe not doing a ground invasion.
Yeah, to avoid sort of a rampant escalation, as you've just laid out. Jeff, thank you so much. Jeff Halper speaking to us there from Jerusalem. As we get developments on this story, we'll bring them to you here.